Hola a todos. My name is Cristel Jusino Diaz. I'm Centro's Director of Research Program in Public Humanities, and I am so excited to be here today to an event that's basically kicking off our weekend of Bad Bunny related events with our symposium following up on Friday and Saturday. But today, to kick this programming off, we have the Teaching Bad Bunny workshop that's going to be facilitated by a group that I am just so excited about. I'm so happy that they've joined us. I'm a big fan of the work, and it's the Hasta Bajo project. That they are the first historical archive of reggaeton in Puerto Rico, and they seek to preserve, educate, and promote the significance of reggaeton in contemporary Puerto Rican culture. As I mentioned, this is part of our big Bad Bunny Symposium weekend, which is titled Thinking with Bad Bunny, Cultural Politics and the Future of Puerto Rico. We have 2 full days ahead on Friday, May 12th and Saturday, May 13th, with some really incredible guests such as Dr. Petra Rivera Rido and Jonathan Rosa, who are going to be our keynote speakers. Cacho Lopez Mari, who was the director of Bad Bunny's El Apagón and Calladita videos, and a number of other scholars, journalists, educators, including Nina Vasquez who's here today facilitating. She's going to be joining us on Friday for a panel titled Mediating Bad Bunny. This symposium is going to be live streamed, and it also be in person at the Silverman School of Social Work. I'm going to be dropping RSVP links for both the in-person part of the symposium and the live stream in the chat for all of those of you that are interested in participating. And with that, I'm going to hand it over to Ashley Oliva Mayor, Nina Vasquez, and Patricia Velázquez of the Hasta Bajo project, who are going to be leading this workshop today. Thank you, everybody.
Hi, everyone. Welcome. Just give us 1 second to load the presentation. Okay, Pat or Nina, can you let me know if we're live with the screen?
We're live.
Okay, perfect. Well, welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us today for a workshop titled Teaching Bad Bunny. We are the Hasta Bajo project. My name is Ashley Oliva Mayor. I am the co-director or co-executive director of Hasta Bajo project. My work focuses on music in particular. So I'm a historian, finishing my PhD in history at Georgetown University. And I've also been a curator for the last 10 years. I also work at the Smithsonian National Museum of American History in the Division of Culture and the Arts, focusing on Latinx music and entertainment. I'm pass it over to my colleague Patricia to introduce herself.
My name is Patricia Velázquez. I am the founder and co-executive director of Hasta Bajo project. I am a history teacher. I have a bachelor's degree in history teaching. I have a master's in cultural administration, and I currently work as a community engagement or community liaison at the National Library of Puerto Rico.
Hi, everyone. Oh, sorry, Ash.
No, you're right, Nina.
Hi, everyone. I'm Nina. Nina Vasquez. I am the Latino curriculum specialist for the Connecticut Historical Society. So I write Latino and Puerto Rican history curriculum for the state of Connecticut. And also I graduated UConn with a master's degree from El Instituto in Puerto Rican and Caribbean history, specifically 19th century Puerto Rico and the independence movements in the 19th century.
Great, perfect. Well, we will jump in here to our presentation by first talking a little bit about our organization, Hasta Bajo project, and the work that we do. So Patricia, take it away.
So our mission is, we are a nonprofit organization. We recently, even though we have been working for almost 4 years, we currently got like our title as a nonprofit organization. We are officially registered. So we at the Bajo Project is a nonprofit organization that seeks to preserve and educate, interpret and promote reggaeton to enhance its importance in Puerto Rican contemporary culture. This is how we divide our mission and how we focus on our work. By preserving, we mean we are creating the first historical archive of reggaeton We're collecting and cataloging archival materials and recording oral histories. We educate through resources, infographic, bibliographies. We also give workshops to students in different places in Puerto Rico. We interpret reggaeton in many ways. Some of them are with playlists that are available in our webpage, the blog, and social media with infographics again. And we promote reggaeton's cultural significance in Puerto Rico and the value that it has in Puerto Rico and around the world, with convening conversations around relevant topics such as race, class, gender, and identity.
Perfect. And so we're going to jump in a little bit now to giving a historical overview of reggaeton, as well as kind of contextualizing Puerto Rican migration and the way that we understand reggaeton as an important legacy of the relationship between Puerto Rico and the world. So we'll talk a little bit about the history, and then we'll move into covering some of the educational resources that we offer at Hasta Bajo Project before ending with kind of an activity breakout so that we can all participate in brainstorming together how to integrate music into our educational practice, and specifically reggaeton. So I want to begin by talking a little bit about, the roots and routes of reggaeton, and understanding it as a genre that's really formed as a result of these transcultural Caribbean encounters and the way in which so many other elements find their way into Puerto Rico and then become, kind of, I think of it as musical hybridity. So all of these kinds of different cultural elements and other genres are absorbed, and then they begin to blend and fuse and merge to create something new. So from there, we'll kind of talk about some of these influences. I like to start first with Jamaica because it is such an important origin point for reggaeton. Jamaicans in particular created reggae, a genre which is reached enormous popularity in the 1960s, and from there kind of has achieved global popularity, particularly now. They also have dance hall as well. And both of those are kind of early influencers to reggaeton. So understanding reggae and the beats that make their way over and are used and sampled frequently in reggaeton. And then understanding that Jamaicans also have an important diaspora as well. They make their way into places like Panama and into New York City as well. And they start diffusing their culture, and from there we get things like reggae en español that comes out of Panama, with some of the kind of crucial contributors being folks like El General and Renato y las Cuatro Estrellas. Renato actually being one of the groups to actually first record in New York City. So important to understand the place of Caribbean diasporas in New York as important to the development of all of these musics. And then, of course, understanding that, the United States has its own strong history of hip hop, rap, jazz, and salsa, and the kind of cultural networks that emerge between the United States and Puerto Rico are important to consider. Reggaeton is not the origin point for collaboration or Caribbean collaboration, but in fact, we see, hip hop and rap coming out of New York City and making its way into Puerto Rico, and kind of that musical exchange and diffusion. And then jazz as well, Puerto Ricans and African Americans being at pivotal moments of collaboration musically start to form these networks, the same with salsa. So understanding that these musical networks and migration are all incredibly influential to building a landscape for reggaeton, that then in Puerto Rico begins to merge first with the underground, in which, it started with rap in Spanish, rap en español, and hip hop. And then from there, they begin to insert vocalizations and samples from things like dancehall, hip hop, and others to create a more unique sound. So we'll move on from there to talk a little bit about Puerto Rican migration, because the title of this talk, of course, is Teaching Bad Bunny, but really we want to focus on how Puerto Rican migration has influenced and impacted the development of reggaeton music. And I love this quote by Jorge Duani, Una nación en vaivén. So understanding the nation on the move as a metaphor for the fluid and hybrid identities of Puerto Ricans on both sides of the Atlantic, and understanding that circular migration pattern that exists between island and diaspora is important to how reggaeton is created, but also how it is disseminated and how it reaches the global level of popularity that we see today. The incredible commercialization in particular that we see today with artists like Bad Bunny. So moving on, talking a little bit historically about the relationship between Puerto Rico and the United States, I'll segue to Nina briefly.
Yeah, so this is definitely my niche. Whenever I talk about reggaeton or think about reggaeton, I'm always thinking and coming from a 19th century lens, ironically. So I just want to give brief little intros on what each thing is, so then we could understand more about reggaeton and its origins. So, 19th century independence struggles are happening all over Puerto Rico. I think that's very important to highlight, that it's not only happening in one centralized place, it's happening across the island, in different niches. Not only that, but the 19th century is a very pivotal moment with identity formation, Puerto Rican identity formation. We see it more in El Grito de Lares, where that's really the battle where a community forms and the term Puerto Ricans is really, really used heavily. So I usually consider the 19th century a very pivotal point for Puerto Rican identity. We move on to 1898 and the US, and then we have what we're looking at is a completely change of government and of everything. So not only we have a new imperial power with the new forms of oppression, they're also, this superpower is also looking at us as a form of military control, so that also plays a big part. Then we move on to the Foraker Act. Oh my God, can't speak today, sorry. And which is when the US really says we're going to establish a form of government in Puerto Rico. However, we're still in control of that form of government, but we're going to give this illusion that looks similar to the form of government that's based in the United States, And then lastly, the Jones Act of 1917, which is personally one of my favorite things to talk about Puerto Rican history. It definitely is another huge turning point for Puerto Rico, because now the U.S. grants citizenship to Puerto Ricans. And now this starts allowing the constant and continuous migration that we're having today that influences hip hop, influences reggaeton, Latin trap, and so on and so forth.
Yeah. So I want to underscore here that, a lot of people would ask, well, what does the 19th century have to do with reggaeton? Well, it's really important to understand that these, I mentioned earlier, these circular patterns of migration, which result in a very strong diasporic community in the United States, is a result of the events that occur before and after 1898. So really understanding the strong communities in the US as being an important part of how Puerto Rican identity unfolds, but also how events on the island are really shaped by these important legacies. Today, life in Puerto Rico is undeniably impacted by the events that occur before and after 1898. So we understand that everything that we listen to in reggaeton, the lived experiences that are shared through the music, are lived experiences that are influenced by these historical events. From there, I want to talk a little bit about, Puerto Ricans in the United States and the communities that we mentioned. Here we're, here today with Centro, who is such a great organization that has done so much work to kind of elevate the history of Puerto Ricans on and off the island. And we definitely want to emphasize that the creation, or that history is incredibly significant, and the creation of these ethnic enclaves in places like Chicago, New York, and more really are central to understanding where we are today. So, Nuyorican identity formation in post-World War II, after the Second World War, we really see an incredible rise in Puerto Rican migration to the United States, but also an incredible boom in terms of Puerto Ricans living in the United States. So understanding just the population increases and what the experiences are of those communities living in the United States, who are often confronting, I call it the urban crisis era of the 1970s, in which there were many efforts to kind of undergo urban renewal in order to, push out certain communities and begin to address some of these mostly poor, crumbling neighborhoods. And through that period, we see solidarity and organizing for social change emerge between African-American communities and Puerto Rican communities and other Afro-Caribbean communities in New York City. So we see Puerto Ricans participating in things like the Congress for Racial Equality, and then forming their own groups like the Young Lords Party, who does so much work in the 1970s and during this decade to really push efforts to provide kind of housing, safe housing in order to provide city services and more. So understanding that the impact in African-American and Puerto Rican communities due to so much of the social and economic issues of the day really give rise to things like hip hop, and hip hop being a strong cultural moment for the fusion of culture that later is translated and brought globally. Nina, I think you wanted to add on here, so I'll pass the mic to you.
Yeah, no, absolutely. So I think, right, one thing that is erased and that we are trying to bring back is really showing that Puerto Ricans and just Caribbean folks have been involved in very, very big cultural movements such as hip hop, right? And I think we tend to downplay hip hop as not a social and cultural movement when it is, right? And now what we're seeing is, thanks to hip hop, we get variations of other subcultures of hip hop. We get reggaeton, and then now we're seeing reggaeton make it to a global form, and then, but it's still olive branching and linking to hip hop, right? Because they both cannot be separated. So I think that's very important. That's something that we see all throughout with things like Boricua Guerreros. We see it with featuring from Zion, and we see in Jandel with people like Snoop Dogg and right, Ja Rule. So again, and Nas, right, and 50 Cent. And now with more common people like Drake. So I just wanted to highlight those big trends.
Yeah, so understanding that as these communities in the US are impacted by everything that's happening historically, we also see many different things happening on the island as well. We transition from, these anti-imperial struggles and fighting for Puerto Rican sovereignty to really understanding the economic upswings and downturns of the 1920s through the 1950s, and then the kind of imposition of Operation Bootstrap in the 1950s and 70s, that then gives rise to, understanding that working class people are incredibly marginalized. There's these racialized and impoverished communities that exist in Puerto Rico as a result of these events, these economic events, and also these imposed political operations. And so from there, we emerge to Mano Dura contra el Crimen, which is very evocative of the kind of war against poverty and war against crime that we see in the United States stateside, but it also is very much a way in order that emerges to demonize racialized and impoverished and marginalized communities in Puerto Rico. So Mano Dura contra el Crimen is a big touch point in the history of reggaeton, because reggaeton really creates a way for the youth and for people in these communities to share their experiences with things like police brutality and systemic racism and systemic discrimination. Mano Dura contra el Crimen really cements the stereotypes of urban Blackness in Puerto Rico. And it's incredibly important as a historical period to understand how in the early years of the genre, before massive commercialization, there were a much more socially conscious and socially charged lyrics present in the music we see. And then from there, we transition into kind of a period of morality media, and that later is paired with kind of this boom in commercialization, where reggaeton, there are attempts to sanitize reggaeton and really, remove some of the more problematic elements of it in order either to make it more socially acceptable or reduce its popularity. Patricia, I think you wanted to maybe add here.
I always like to mention that with Mano Dura contra el Crimen and with morality media, this created like a narrative on reggaeton and reggaetoneros and the people who listen to reggaeton, that these people were like the causes of the criminality in Puerto Rico. And till today, like this was like, imagine this for all over the 90s and the early 2000s, create like a constant attack on reggaeton. With morality media, it was all over like media, like the news, TV, radio stations and everything. Imagine like getting like this narrative on reggaeton that is criminal, that till today it remains. That's why it's very difficult. That's what we're working for, to understand that violence, like reggaeton is violent because violence exists, not like, I'm sorry. Reggaeton does not create violence. So we like to also mention that.
Yeah, and understanding that, music was an important facet of the campaign Mano Dura contra el Crimen. Many record stores were raided in the 1990s, mid-1990s. Music was confiscated, and there were attempts to kind of criminalize the folks who performed reggaeton and also who listened to reggaeton. So in trying to draw those ties between youth delinquency and crime and music, which is not a new thing. So we'll move on briefly to talk about culture and how these cultural elements are exchanged between island and diaspora as we unite these kind of urban experiences from the diaspora and the island. So I want to start by saying, Harlem and the Bronx and Puerto Rican and Caribbean diasporas that reside in New York City, but also in other urban areas across the country, like Chicago and, in Massachusetts and Connecticut and many other places as well, create cultural networks with far-reaching impacts. And these cultural networks are exchanging not just the music and the art that is birthed from their urban realities, but it also creates kind of a pattern of exchange and circulation, so that we're constantly in conversation. When we listen to things like salsa, salsa becomes a global genre, and it is listened to globally. Artists both on and off the island achieve incredible popularity. The same is true for hip hop. Hip hop achieves global popularity, and that culture is circulated between island and diaspora and back. And also understanding that at the core, places in Puerto Rico like residenciales, caseríos, and the marginalized communities that exist there and whose experiences are very similar to those of the diaspora in periods of urban renewal, are what give rise to reggaeton as we know it.
I wanted to add, Ash.
See.
On salsa, I wanted to add that salsa and reggaeton were created like with the same ingredients, like the exchanges between la diaspora and ¿verdad? The Caribbean diaspora in New York and other places in the United States. And so it was made out of like from different generations, but it was like the similar exchanges of the diaspora and La Isla and other islas in the Caribbean. That even like the narratives on these songs, like you can listen to some salsa songs and listen to reggaeton songs, and the discourses on violence, for example, are like very similar. So we are seeing like the same problems like going through generations of diaspora and Caribbeans being shown through music, because music is like the radiography of people, like the way of expression. So yeah.
Perfect. Just moving on into talking a little bit about some manifestations of la cultura, of this cultural encounter and cultural exchange that occurs in, you know, la nación en vaivén, the nation on the move. So I wanted to start with sound and the ways in which sound really is heard, exchanged, absorbed, reproduced, sampled. You know, there are so many important things to recognize about reggaeton as a genre. The first being the dembow rhythm, which makes up most reggaeton. So understanding Jamaican rhythms as an origin point, and the presence of Jamaicans and Puerto Ricans in New York City, and also, you know, Caribbean migration, inter-Caribbean migration as well. So how these rhythms are exchanged and then later sampled in so many musics. And then we see kind of the collaboration, musical collaboration that exists between reggaeton and hip hop in ways many hip hop songs are sampled. Nina mentioned several artists earlier in the presentation. And we have a short video here of Baby Hasta y Gringo from The Noise. So we'll just listen quickly to a little bit of sound. So what we can really see here is how the rapping over the beat is one of the elements of sound that really makes its way into reggaeton. Folks acknowledging themselves or naming themselves as like DJs, and some of the important aspects of the hip hop subculture that migrate their way into reggaeton. So, you know, understanding things like those rhythms and the way that reggaeton vocalizes over a rhythm as being an essential manifestation of these cultural connections. I also want to mention Boricua Guerrero, which is a particular recording that took place in 1997 between DJ Playero and Nico Canada, where they kind of went to a hotel room in New York City for 2 months to try and produce music. And the kind of result of their efforts was really this album called Boricua Guerrero. And it brought together underground and reggaeton artists with up-and-comers and hip-hop artists. And so it was able to really appeal to a wider US audience by relating and showing the connection between hip-hop and reggaeton. Pat, I think you had a little bit more to say on Boricua Guerrero here as well.
No, with Boricua Guerrero, as Ashley mentioned, it was created like in the States and everything. But here you can see or listen to a very authentic, like very explicit mix between Puerto Rico and its diaspora. So it's like a very good album to listen to when you're seeking for like to hear those voices very explicitly. Yeah.
And it's one of the I think it was Eduardo Cepeda for Remezcla that called it kind of one of the most ambitious crossover events in history, and mentioned that it served as a sort of declaration of war, an outlining of the myth of borders, and it referred to the Puerto Rico and the mainland US as two nations united by the collaboration. So understanding sound as evidence of this collaboration, community collaboration. And from there, we'll move on into slang and the way in which language begins to change and shift with these kind of musical genres, or how these musical genres are evidence of these shifting kinds of language. So Spanglish obviously is a key part when you live in a space that is dominated by particular ethnicities, and you have people who are Spanish speakers and English speakers and maybe bilingual speakers. You begin to get a mix of words as people are adapting to their environment and adapting to the different linguistic capacities of the folks around them. And so we get terms like joseo, which is kind of like hustle, and hanguear, to hang out. These Spanglish verbs that originate through these experiences in community and in diaspora. And then they migrate their way back, between island and diaspora. And so we see so much of these words evidenced in reggaeton songs. Nina, I think that you had some more to add here.
Yes, I do. So my favorite part, I honestly have to say, about reggaeton is the slang, right? I think it's very evident that it's as simple as going to visit your tia in New York City, hearing her say a word, coming back to the island, say, yo, I heard this new word. And then, you start mixing it up and it starts evolving and it starts evolving and it starts evolving, right? And I think that we tend to sometimes overcomplicate the role of migration when it could be as simple as visiting Titi in the summer, right? So also it's the perfect example is also hip hop, right? Again, it shows this common thread with hip hop. Hip hop does the same thing. It takes words that are usually in mainstream and it changes it up for the sake of rhythm, beats, or honestly just culture and just for the fun of it, right? So again, seeing this very, very visible thread with the diasporic lives and cultures and the life that's happening and blossoming on the island as well.
Yeah, understanding Puerto Rican families and those intergenerational relationships as really important for how we see language, how we learn language, and how we share that language. Thanks, Nina. So we'll move on to the next way we understand reggaeton culture manifest, and that's style. In the ways in which style from the diaspora makes its way into Puerto Rico and into reggaeton, and then it's kind of circulated back. So understanding things like the aesthetics of graffiti, but also things like sneaker culture and hats and chains, and kind of the aesthetics of what it takes to be an urban music artist are then reproduced in reggaeton, which is like the, in urbano, spaces. So understanding style is an important element of what it means to be, a reggaetonera, reggaetonero, or reggaetonere. So understanding these artists is using style and being influenced by the style of hip hop in particular, but also as trends shift, new styles emerge, and we see that evolution take place. Nails, for example, and other things. Nina, I think you also wanted to add here.
Yes, for sure. I think one of the most common things is a lot of conversation around where did Daddy Yankee get the baggy clothes from? Where is Evie Queen getting like the big earrings from, right? And a lot of it goes back to New York Rican culture, right? And the fact that we also have shared a very long history and a long struggle with African American culture and also other Black diasporic cultures, for sure. So thinking that we're thinking bigger than a New York Rican and a Puerto Rican diasporic, but we're also thinking of a Black diasporic culture and history that's taking place.
Yeah, absolutely. And those elements of style, things like staying fresh, the terms for how we understand style are also, an important part of that cultural connection that Nina mentioned. So we'll move on from there and talk a little bit about stereotypes, because one of the important facets of understanding reggaeton and its relationship to the diaspora and also its relationship to hip hop is how kind of stereotypes emerge about these musics, and understanding that these stereotypes are not new. So many, on this slide, you'll see in the corner, there's a notice that says, "Stop, help save the youth of America. Don't buy Negro records." And it's important to understand how, in the jazz era, in earlier eras of music, there was an important association between the music that youth listened to and whether or not the youth were considered delinquents, were exposed to negative influences. And so reggaeton begins similarly to hip hop, similarly to jazz in its era as well, to become associated with these elements of criminality and juvenile delinquency in particular. And so many people begin to speak out about the ways in which folks are criminalizing reggaeton. And the video you see here is Ivy Queen and her single, "Somos raperos pero no delincuentes," "We are rappers, not delinquents." And we'll listen to a bit of this. And so what we can see here, she says, "Nos juzgan por vestirnos así." They judge us for dressing like this. So understanding that all of these relationships between reggaeton and the stereotypes that emerge about it being bad for the youth, it supporting violence, as Patricia mentioned earlier, it having a relationship to things like drug consumption. These are all elements that really create, stereotypes of reggaeton listeners and artists as being proponents of crime and proponents of youth delinquency. And it's important to understand that that's not new. In hip hop, it's very much the same, this association between hip hop and youth delinquency and crime. The newspaper title that you see at the top of the screen, "Juvenile crime, the offenders are younger and the offenses more serious." That's from the New York Times, 1987. So understanding that that these relationships and this criminalization of reggaeton is not new, and it really influences how we view the genre today and how many people still hold so much prejudice about the genre. Racism and classism are at the root of these prejudices. Reggaeton, being identified as a particularly, as a genre with, coming from marginalized and racialized communities, similar to hip hop, is at the root for why these entrenched prejudices occur. So much that when we at Hasta Bajo Project say reggaeton es cultura, reggaeton is culture, we get enormous backlash because people don't want to accept that this is an important cultural product because they view it so lowly. Patricia, I think maybe you wanted to add something here as well.
No, I think you have mentioned it. And I already, before I said, the views on reggaeton and using it as a chivo expiatorio. I don't know how to say it in English, but as the cause of violence in Puerto Rico comes from the stereotypes which are based in racism and classism. Classism?
Yes. Sí.
Racismo y clasismo. Scapegoat. Okay.
Yes. Yes. So it's important to understand that these stereotypes are shared stereotypes, and there are stereotypes that also are still present today, despite the fact that the genre is incredibly whitewashed and heavily commercialized now. So we'll move on a little bit to listening to some more music. So I'll play this clip and then we'll talk about it.
Levanta tu bandera con ganas, jala. Yo también tengo pistola y también pierdo la chola. Como Kika, se juntaron los boricuas. Si no te muere ahora, te muere ahorita. Esta liga ya no es pa' cascarita. Lean back,
Okay, Patricia, do you want to jump in?
Yes. Here we can see Tego Calderon singing "Lean Back." He was I think he was the only Spanish-speaking rapper on this song or remix of the song, performing live at a BET. I think there were some awards. I saw Tego live singing this song, and people in Puerto Rico, like everybody at the audience, was singing with him, "Lean Back." So even if we maybe do not understand what the song is saying, we are vibing to the song and we are like trying to say the same things that Tego is saying. And we can also see explicitly the collaboration between the Puerto Ricans in la diaspora with Puerto Ricans from the island, and between hip hoppers and rappers in the United States. And next we are going to see. Oh, I wanted to mention antes de movernos al próximo slide. I wanted to mention like these relations or these like collaborations between reggaeton or Latin trap artists or raperos de Puerto Rico with raperos from the US. We like a recent example is Tremendo Cabrón from Eladio Carrión. Here in this album, we can see collaborations with Future, Lil Wayne, 50 Cent, Quavo, Rich the Kid, Lil TJ, Fivio Foreign. So these collaborations, they keep going. Like there's no separation between Puerto Rico and la diaspora with music. And we can see that connection still going on. How Nina said, visiting Artia, we cannot like stop visiting our family from La Isla or us from La Isla going to the States, but also we can see it in art, in music, and all of that.
Yeah.
So next.
And I'll just add, Tego is one of the artists that, is very much helped to popularize reggaeton. He's one of the leading artists in reggaeton and still very much is loved by many of the folks that remember its early years. And one of the things that Tego really did through platforms like BET is help to cement the relationship between Afro-Puerto Ricans on the island and African Americans in the United States. And he really helped to elevate an understanding of a larger African diaspora that traversed both island and diaspora. So we'll move on to the next bit of music because this is teaching Bad Bunny, so we have to play some Bad Bunny.
Si tengo muchas novias, muchas novias. Hoy tengo a una, mañana a otra. Me las voy a llevar a todas pa' un VIP, ey. Saluden a Titi, vamos a tirarnos un selfie. 6 chis, ey. Que sonrían las que ya les metí en un VIP, ey. Saluden a Titi, vamos a tirarnos un selfie. 6 chis, que sonrían las que ya se olvidaron de mí. Me gusta mucho la.
So here we see Bad Bunny and his global hit, Titi Me Preguntó, in which he filmed in New York City. And if you actually listen to the song, you can hear elements of Spanglish in things like selfie, in things like, in other words that he, VIP, that he sings and repeats often. And so we see that Spanglish take place. We see kind of the geography of the diaspora, right, in New York City. And then we also see some of these other elements that demonstrate these relationships. Patricia, I think you also want to add here.
No, I see this video strategically done by Bad Bunny just to celebrate diaspora. And not only diaspora, but the La Hermandad between Puerto Rico and the Dominican Republic, since this song is a dembow song, which comes from Dominican Republic. We can see bodegas on these other places, like he's mentioning even Mexico, Colombia, and like New York is the melting pot of all these different diasporas coming in together, and he's just celebrating that with this video.
Yeah, Nina, I think you had something to add here as well.
Yeah, I did. And I wanted to add two things. One, I think just thinking about Bad Bunny and teaching about Bad Bunny, we definitely have to teach and think with intentionality, right? Because he does things with intentionality. Titi Me Pregunto, his video was not a coincidence, right? It was chosen for that to look like that, to be like that, to sound like that, right? To represent that. And I think also it's very strategic because I did attend one of his stadium concerts in Yankee Stadium. And as well, that was a very intentional concert where the guests were also very intentional. And also he even dedicated a whole segment in the speech talking about the diaspora, meshing it with salsa fania specifically, also giving a shout out to hip hop artists, as well as then bringing in Romeo Santos, which is a very big phase for the Puerto Rican diaspora and the Dominican diaspora, right? So he's very intentional with his stuff. So I think like when we think and we teach about Bad Bunny, we have to think and teach with intentionality.
Yeah, and understanding that even, from his earlier concerts, like the tour bus or bus concert during COVID, where he rode around New York City on a bus, to his latest set at Coachella, which also integrates so much of that cultural history and these cultural elements. We have to understand that artists carefully cultivate their persona, their onstage persona. And so many of Bad Bunny's fans come from the diaspora. It is a huge market, and understanding who his fans are, I think that many times his persona speaks to the fans in particular ways. So moving on from there, we'll talk a little bit about some of the educational resources that we offer at Hasta Bajo Project before diving into some activities. So from here, we first and foremost an archive. So because Reggaetón es cultura, we collect archival materials that we hold in our archive and provide access to researchers and folks who are looking to study Reggaetón. So we're really trying to build primary sources for the study of Reggaetón, for educators and folks who are working in communities to be able to utilize for their students to use, and also for many others to be able to reference in their work. The second thing that we have provided, and that we'll actually be sharing via a link in the chat, are our Hasta Bajo workbooks. So we have an Hasta Bajo resource drive that we'll be sharing with all of you, and 2 volumes of a workbook in which we share strategies for cultivating conversations with learners, and also for methods to engage, use music as this lens and this entry point to really engage learners. I'll segue briefly here to Patricia, who has led so many of our kind of workshops with young learners using these workbooks, and as many of us have done, and how our workbooks are something that make Reggaetón, a learning experience, or bring it into the learning experience. Patricia?
Sure. So I have been going to different places, from colegios to public schools to caseríos, presenting to young learners, as Ashley mentioned, about the story of Reggaeton, its cultural importance, and the history, the representation of the Puerto Rican culture through Reggaeton, and how we as contemporary people living today, how we are also important for culture and for history in the making. So it makes students more like they're part of something big, like we're part of reggaeton, so reggaeton is something big. So we're part of that, and that makes like un sentido like de pertinencia and an emotion from the kids. This workbook we have made with so much love. It has been growing with us. Every workshop that we give, we make a change or we add something new. Particularly from this workbook, I like to also like highlight a page that is called like listening to reggaeton consciously. Someone already wrote here on the chat saying that reggaeton talks about smoking, hypersexualization, consumerism, violence, and everything. And yes, it does, because it's a reflection of what these artists see, live, or fantasize about. So kids listening to this, we have to help them get through this music. So we cannot misunderstand or the capacity of kids to understand or reflect on something. And we have to teach children what is good and what is bad. And in this workbook, we have a page that it says, like I mentioned, like how to listen to reggaeton consciously. And some, like you can access them later. But one, for example, we say like, okay, reggaeton talks about violence, but we don't have to be violent. Like music do not define us or our actions. And yeah, we can listen to reggaeton and wonder like, or problematize what it's saying. What it's saying, like, okay, this is talking about, I don't know, shooting someone down. We already know that, well, like we have to teach kids this is not okay. And you can listen to this and while listening, saying, okay, that is not okay. But still listening to the song, because we can be both. We can be reggaeton listeners and critical thinkers. We can be reggaeton listeners, dale perreadora, and we can be students and professionals. So we are working with that, like the multi-dimensionality of a human being or what we can be, or so through reggaeton. So yeah.
And one of the important parts of our workbook is not just, creating these opportunities for conversation about, listening in a conscious manner or critical thinking, but also how to really understand that, our learners, young people, youth are already listening to this music, and this is a way to get them to learn about something. If Hamilton could use hip hop to teach people about, the American Revolution, then, we can use reggaeton to teach students about migration, about Puerto Rican history, and about so much more math, science, so many different elements of education that are important for them to get at a young age, but using reggaeton as the way in to teach these concepts. And so our workbook also does that. It uses reggaeton as an entry point to get students to practice different skills, to think critically, and to be creative as well.
And also I want to add that it works for every age, even though it has like pages like colorate this or find this, like it may seem like elemental, like for elementary children, but everyone enjoys these workbooks, even like la abuela or the leaders from the groups and the teachers. Everybody enjoys doing this workbook, and it's going to be available for everyone in this workshop.
Yes. And as I mentioned, we have a research drive we'll be sharing in the chat that has volumes 1 and 2 of the workbook. But also via our website, we share other educational content and educational resources like bibliographies for you to be able to find sources that talk about, explain, and interpret reggaeton. And we also have playlists that are curated by some of our collaborators around different themes, like, reggaeton as an Afro-descendant genre, or women in reggaeton, or Dominican influence in reggaeton. These are all playlists that we offer to help people listen critically and enjoy listening to reggaeton while thinking about the different cultural elements that are present in the music. And then we also have lesson plans to really create these interdisciplinary curriculum connections. And so I'll leave it to Nina to explain a little bit more about our lesson plans.
Yeah, thank you. I'm so excited about the lesson plan. So as I mentioned before, I do write lesson plans for the Connecticut Historical Society. And Frank makes an awesome point about Reggaetón makes connections to bomba, which I just want to throw out there. I actually wrote that's a lesson plan that's being piloted right now in the state that has to do with reggaeton and bomba. So I'm very excited with that. So it is out there, right? We are thinking about things like that. I hope in the future to bring that to Hasta Bajo project. But currently, yeah, I'm bringing in lesson plans about just the history, general history of reggaeton, starting off there, right? Because there's a lot of like just misconceptions of the genre, especially in the diaspora. A lot of when I teach here, because I teach a lot and I work a lot with high schoolers, I've noticed that a lot of my Puerto Rican high schoolers who were born in the US don't feel connected to the genre, right? Because they say that doesn't belong to them. That's not their thing. They don't feel seen or embodied or whatever because of the genre. They definitely see it more as a Puerto Rican Islander thing, right? So my job with these lesson plans is to really encompass and give this, like, reggaeton is an Islander thing, as well as it is a diasporic thing, as it is a community thing, as it is a political thing, right? And a historical thing. So definitely I try to make the lesson plans very interactive. I understand that students learn in all different capacities, so I always add an activity that's more critical thinking based, discussion based, then another activity that's more artsy, right? I have a lot of students that really process history and things, hard topics through the arts. And then I have others that just process it through just talking and discussion, like a regular college setting, right, for high schoolers. But I just try to give variety and think about different learning things. And if you guys ever have any like cool things that you suggest or ways or activities that you guys might think of or do in your classrooms, let me know. I would love to hear and talk about that.
Yeah. And so moving on, we'll move to our kind of breakout activities. So in the chat, you kind of already mentioned where you're tuning in from, but if you want to share what brought you to today's workshop while we get the link live and share our Jamboard.
Actually, antes de movernos, after we move forward, I wanted also to mention the donations. Here we have like a QR code with the link to a formulario where you can or like get, with the donation of $30, you will receive a shirt that says Reggaetón is Cultura. This will help us grow. We have been working for 4 years now, and we're getting even bigger and bigger. Like we have done this presentation. This is very big for us at Bajo project. We have done workshops and presentations from the New York Public Library. People like, I don't know, like Congresswoman Nidia Velázquez have been saying to us, like, encourage us to keep moving forward. So it is very important to us, and we are very grateful with the support we have been given. So if you want to donate and have this t-shirt, you can scan the QR code. So yeah, that was it. Thank you.
I will bring the QR code back up in a second once we finish our Jamboard session. So if Nina, are you able to put the link to the Jamboard in the chat, please?
I already did, yes, but okay, I can do it.
Perfect. So if everybody would like to click the link and join our Jamboard, we're going to have a practice session where we brainstorm how to develop activities that integrate music and reggaeton into the classroom. Each of the Jamboard slides is separated into different subject areas. So we encourage everyone to drop Post-it notes with ideas for how you would use reggaeton in a learning space or in your own educational practice. So we'll segue momentarily to the Jamboard before coming back here for a Q&A. So if you click this adhesive note, it drops a Post-it, and you can head to each of the subject areas and add a Post-it note. So for literature, you can do, for example, lyric analysis as a Post-it, and you can pop it in the curriculum connections. So that's an example of how you can use the Jamboard.
I think
The Jamboard is having issues. It's not allowing people to go in.
but so many people are logged in.
So I'm not sure.
I think maybe there's a limit on how many folks can enter.
It could be.
Yeah, I think we have 68 participants. So maybe we'll give folks about 10 minutes to be in the Jamboard. And then if you can leave the Jamboard so someone else can go in, we'd appreciate it. But so far, let's see how the Post-it notes are going. Watch videos in history. Think about race, gender depictions. These are great. Dance classes. Absolutely. We've actually hosted a perreo workshop in Puerto Rico, and we talked about autonomy, enjoyment, and perreo. So we are open to conversations about, dance and reggaeton as an embodied experience. Yeah, spoken word, poetry, and rap workshops, painting and listening to a curated playlist of the trajectory of reggaeton while having casual discussion about its influences. Yes, yeah. Oh, this is great. Thinking about a law social science class based on how arts can be used as a way to justify exclusion and oppressive law policies and regulations. This is absolutely true. And actually some academics are currently working on this. I'm blanking on the name, but they're actually doing research into how in the most recent case in Georgia, lyrics are being used as evidence in criminal trials. And how even law and social science has this intersection with music, and particularly with how lived experiences are shared in music, and how kind of coded language exists as well to relate to things like these policies. So I think we're at 4:10 now. So maybe if you've already dropped a couple Post-its, maybe cycle out so others can cycle in. Kelsey, will the slides be available after the sessions? We will make our resource drive available, and we can load a PDF of our slides onto the resource drive for you. Thank you for asking. Yeah, the Jamboard is actually accessible via our resource drive. So it is shared with participants later, and you should be able to enter the Jamboard and continue dropping ideas even after this workshop is done. I'm going to pop our resource drive link into the chat momentarily. So if you see this research drive here, you can see that we have things categorized by Volume 1 workbook, Volume 2 workbook, our bibliography or short bibliography, some lesson plans, and playlists as well. You have a short kind of document that talks a little bit about us as an organization in English and Spanish, and then access to the Jamboard here. As we mentioned, so much of our workbooks we use in Spanish in Puerto Rico, but we do have English versions for those of you that work with English language learners. Oh, go ahead, Pat.
It's not about the workbooks, but about resources. El Centro has, like, the archives has the collection of Raquel Zeta Rivera. She donated everything she used for her investigation on reggaeton to the archives of El Centro. So that's also a very important collection that with primary resources, which are very important. And other primary resources are old or past Centro magazine. ¿Cómo es que se llama? La revista El Centro.
Yes.
where it has like different essays and writings on reggaeton. Centro Journal, gracias Cristel, perdón. Centro Journal is a very good resource with reggaeton, hip hop, diaspora, and everything.
No worries, Mariel. Text boxes work as well. On the screen, you'll see I'm just sharing some of our cuadernos. So this is a workbook sheet called Reggaeton and Me, and it asks people to think about some questions for reggaeton. The first time you listen to reggaeton, how do you feel when you listen to reggaeton? Is it good or bad? Why? What memories you have related to reggaeton, your favorite artists, and how songs maybe have influenced your decisions. And then we have some fun activities like creating the cover of your own CD, writing a reggaeton song by using blank space, using the verses of a song to kind of recreate your own version. And then things like word searches, sneaker designs, and then also we have a newest activity, which kind of we are debuting for this workshop, which is using historical figures and creating a playlist of reggaeton songs that you think this person would listen to based on their life and narrative. So folks like Ramon Emeterio Betances, Lolita Lebrón, Silvia Rivera, Arturo Schomburg, Jose Chacha Jimenez, Pura Belpre, and others. Pat and I and Nina were talking about what reggaeton songs we think these folks would listen to. And we were having a really good time thinking about Lolita Lebrón listening to Malianteo.
Tuñengo flow specifically.
Specifically. So we have historical figures, and then you can create your 5-song playlist. We also have things like maps where you can chart migration patterns between the Caribbean and the United States, as well as migration math. So thinking about how the population of Puerto Ricans in the United States and the migration from Puerto Rico to the US has impacted reggaeton. And so we provide the figures here to kind of help students chart and think about how population numbers influence the popularity of music. So this is a little bit about our workbook. And then if you go to other sections, you'll find our lesson plans here as well.
Do we want to move on to Q&A, Ash, since we have 15 minutes or a little less?
Yeah, sure. No problem. I will, I'll close here and we'll move back to our presentation. So from here, we're going to move into just Q&A quickly. So if anyone has a question, feel free to either put it in the Q&A function, or we can move to the chat as well. So in Q&A, I see that Joey Figueroa asks, what are the panelists' thoughts on the influence of reggaeton on the genre in West Africa, Afrobeats? Which influenced which genre? And I think that this is a really interesting question. I think of Afrobeats as something that has like emerged in confluence with reggaeton and really through similar influence. And the ways in which Afrobeats also have impacted reggaeton, there's like subgenres of reggaeton that draw a lot of influence and sample things like Afrobeats. There's even, you know, aspects of reggaeton that sample like Egyptian music as well. So and understanding that the music that goes on in West Africa, in the African continent, does kind of cycle back through the African diaspora, and its relationship and rhythmic influence is certainly present, I think. So answered live. So next question comes from an anonymous attendee. how popular was reggaeton in the African American community in the US? Were there any popular reggaeton songs artists played in African American radio stations? Well, I know that Nina and I, we've talked about this before, where there were some kind of hip hop and African American stations that would have like a certain DJ or set that was devoted to reggaeton in the early 2000s. And then before even some Spanish language stations started integrating reggaeton into their radio play. And then obviously understanding that platforms like BET, which brought a lot of attention to folks like Tego Calderon and others in the genre, including Ivy Queen, were also through these platforms that reached African American communities. I talk a lot also about like the way the Selena movie was aired on BET is why so many African Americans really, Selena resonates with them as well as a community because of the way in which we absorb media and content that we listen to. So thanks for your question, anonymous attendee. And then, Rolando Robles Ramirez, how do I get a shirt? You can use the QR code on the screen. And you should be able to go directly to our form, our Google form, which allows you to type in your information. And if you donate $30, we will get you your t-shirt. So how do you see the Jamboard? We've already kind of shared, and it'll also be accessible through our resource drive that I have shared the link for already. Flor Reyes, what do y'all think about the current discourse around colorism with reggaeton artists and its commercialization? This is something that we focus on a lot at Hasta Bajo because so much of the roots of reggaeton are grounded in it as a representation of Afro-Puerto Ricanness and Blackness on the island. And so the current discourse is really elevating the fact that many reggaeton artists today who have achieved the most popularity in the music industry are often people that are whitewashed, are white identifying. And it's really as a result of this process of commercialization, which has also led to kind of a whitening of the genre. And we have to understand that as the kind of resources that are available to artists and the ways in which people who have more access to those resources and those opportunities may also be why we see the kind of racial background of folks who are most popular now. Patricia, do you want to kind of expand on that question?
I think you have answered it. It has to be definitely with capitalism and commercialization of everything. It hasn't happened only in reggaeton. It has happened in many Black created music that eventually go mainstream with the whitewashing and everything. I think even though reggaeton, we can see like the hyper commercialization and the whitewashing, but still reggaeton is very essential, like it very grassroots. And in Puerto Rico and even in the States, like this, the art, like the youth is using this music, and not only like lighter skinned youth in Puerto Rico and the diaspora, also like also colored kids, Black kids from Puerto Rico and diaspora are using this music, and we can see that in spaces like Freestyle Mania. Freestyle Mania is a page where kids rap, youth rap, people rap to compete between each other. And there we can see the essence of reggaeton, the African descent essence on reggaeton. Like, even though the biggest artists are white, like the people still making reggaeton are people from like African descent, from Puerto Rico.
Perfect. And I see that Susan in the chat also says we have to think about how Afro beats are influenced by Jamaican reggae. So going back to Joey's question about Afrobeats and its relationship to reggaeton, absolutely, yes. Jamaican reggae, as I mentioned, originated in the 1960s and gained global popularity. And there's incredibly large Jamaican diasporas present in the UK and many other places because colonialism. And so we see kind of this influence, the Jamaican influence globally in music just as much. And Trinidadian Calypso, yes, Susan. And Calypso also achieved a lot of popularity in its time. Calypso music was also popular in the United States for people, for many people as well. So another question by Joey, what are the panelists' thoughts on the expansion of reggaeton to Latin countries beyond Puerto Rico, such as Argentina, Colombia, etc.? I would say that reggaeton being such a global genre now and having global popularity means that many other Latin countries are kind of riding the wave of reggaeton as a popular music genre. And that means that in some places they are participating in the genre creation. There are a lot of very high profile artists today that come from other countries that are not Puerto Rico, but often they are still mimicking some of the essential elements of Puerto Ricanness in their music. So a lot of the jerga, a lot of the slang is still Puerto Rican. The people who are in the studio producing the music are Caribbean, often Puerto Rican or Dominican. And so we have to understand that, you know, as the genre has grown and has achieved so much popularity, many other countries come to the space trying to also, you know, contribute to reggaeton. In some cases, that's through kind of these appropriations of culture, but in other ways, in Cuba, for example, reggaeton has influenced the development of other genres in Cuba, like reparto and cubatón, where they take their own kind of Cuban musical elements and they merge it with reggaeton to make something that's uniquely kind of Cuban and also reggaeton, or also in you know, in that sense. So I think that there's a lot to be said for the expansion of reggaeton globally and how each country individually enters into a musical production space with reggaeton. We're at the 5-minute mark, so we're going to be doing some closing remarks. From there, I think that we'll just end with the last questions from Kelsey Milian. What are your thoughts on the conversations of the intersections of reggaeton with the LGBT community? At Hasta Bajo project, we actually cover what we call el giro queer, the queer turn of reggaeton, because we really see LGBTQIA+ communities as being the most creative at the moment when it comes to reggaeton, and really building spaces for themselves to talk about their own experiences in reggaeton. We have very good relationships with some of the queer reggaeton artists on the island. Patricia, you can talk a little bit about those collaborations.
Of course, we for like, it was like 2 years ago for Pride, we produced like a whole presentation documental of queer reggaeton is hayaera. Hayaera is a word often used in Puerto Rico by the queer community here. So we produced a video and presentation on we produced a presentation, like a documentary on reggaeton and queerness with Ana Macho, with reggaeton drag performers, and talking about the relations between reggaeton and the queerness. So yeah, we have done that previously.
Yeah, and I encourage everyone to follow us on our social media channels, where we are constantly pushing content out and notifying folks of new and up and coming workshops and events and programs, where you can learn a little bit more about the different communities and community organizations that we partner with and collaborate with, like El Center for Puerto Rican Studies. We've done other collaborations with, for example, last year we did one with El Centro Cultural de Vega Baja. We've partnered with other organizations like the New York Public Library, and you can find out about all of those things by going to our website and following us on our social media channels. Thank you so much for joining us today. We are at the conclusion of this workshop. It was a pleasure to be here with you all, and thank you very much for joining us from myself, Patricia, and Nina.